All right, thank you to the speakers. So I would like to open the floor for discussion. I would like members of the committee to come up with questions. I'm going to start the discussion bringing some of the issues that we've been hearing in this panel, in the prior panel. We're talking about development of new compounds, but we're also talking about research. So now when we're actually looking in terms of funding, the government has been releasing funds for increasing or improving treatment, but if we look at the numbers of funding for pain research or the interaction between pain and opioids, hasn't been increased. I mean, to my knowledge, the last time the NIH, in terms of NIDA, released an RFA, which is a request for specific applications on addiction and pain, was in 2010. And I think Dave Thomas was in charge of that. So I mean, in order to increase that research, we have to get more funding. And the other barrier that we have is also study sections, as Howard says. Sometimes this is not appealing to the reviewers. So I would like for the panelists to comment on that. Howard?
Yeah, I think, is this microphone on? It doesn't sound like it.
Yeah.
Oh, is it? Okay. So, yeah, I think that's the critical issue is how should NIH or the FDA or the government in general target a specific question. So the specific question we're dealing with here is how do we get, an analgesic that doesn't have side effects but is highly effective? How can we exploit what we know about how good analgesics work and what produces their side effects? Now that's a problem that ordinarily you would think a pharmaceutical company would go after. But there's a lot of discovery there in that we don't understand the mechanisms, for example, of opioid dependence. Is it necessary for a drug to produce optimal analgesia for it to also produce dependence? And it's beginning to appear that that's not the case. But to get a study section to approve a grant that's basically a development grant would seem to be very difficult.
So my comment to that is there are crises in our society, and I think we have one here in the pain area, which require government to invest, and in the same way that we are fortunate to now have the BRAIN initiative, which is putting hundreds of millions of dollars into studying the human brain, but there's no mention of pain in that initiative at all. So we need a similar kind of massive investment in the pain area. And we know how difficult this drug development is. Many of the efforts are going to fail. But if we don't invest in it, we're not going to get through to the next. So somehow, in the same way that hundreds of millions of dollars have been found, federal and private matching funds from industry have been found for the BRAIN initiative, we need an equivalent size thing for the pain field that will include drug development, will include basic science, will include the genotypic studies. So I think otherwise the investment is so tiny, and in consequence the timeline of new discoveries becomes so low. We're not dealing with this massive problem in front of us. 100 million Americans in chronic pain, and we do not have the tools to treat it. That is something we have to address.
Have a comment?
Well, my comment is we need to do more in translational science. That's where we really have a logjam. The one compound that I talked about is not alone in terms of needing financing. There are several other products that have come across my desk in the last few years that are essentially shovel-ready to go into clinical trials, but they're waiting for funding. And they're novel drugs. They have new mechanisms of action. They've already proven efficacy in animal models. We need to be able to enhance the ability to take those into initial human clinical trials.
I would like to see if Dave Thomas has a comment on this, since he's been dealing with before in the funding of pain research and opioids in the past. So he had any suggestions on how NIH NIDA is going to move forward with this?
Right, I was afraid you were going to say that. It's always looking at me. We definitely, NIDA invests a lot in pain, and I'll defend us in that way. And the NIH Pain Consortium, a number of us do fund a lot, and CCIH puts a third of their budget into it. The problem is at the NIH is we have 25 institutes that deal with pain, and not all of them put as much money in as we can. And it's also a zero-sum game where we have to take things away. Certainly, our number one priority right now is prescription opiate abuse and pain with that. We're looking for funds from DHHS, money has to come from somewhere. And and we're trying from our level to get money from above and also do what we can with what we have. So I think the bottom line is, I mean, I'm an advocate for you guys. I hear what you're saying. I know we need better pain treatments, and that means money. And so we're trying, and we are funding at a fairly good level if you look institute by institute that's very involved with that. But I think we do need more of a collective effort.
Thanks, David. Valerie?
Hello. Really, really informative. Valerie Reyna from the committee. My question sort of follows up, I think, Dr. Phil, something that you were alluding to, and it's about mechanism-driven research. Do we know, in terms of the basic construct of pain, the degree to which the absence of pain corresponds to the presence of pleasure? So in other words, is this two constructs or one construct? And I think you were getting at that a little bit. And in addition to that, I think from a behavioral point of view, perhaps economic theory point of view, I know a number of people would be concerned that if you remove the adverse consequences from such drugs, that although you might affect tolerance in a positive way, you might affect psychological dependence in a negative way. In other words, if you remove negative consequences, people may be, in fact, more psychologically dependent.
Yeah, that's a very insightful question, and it gets at the issue of the two uses of pain, if you will. One is it's a motivation to escape and want to terminate it, but it's also something that happens after you do something and tells you, look, what you just did wasn't so good. So those are two different functions. Chronic pain is a motivational state. Opioid dependence is a motivational state. Both of them produce this desire to take the drug. If you have a headache and you take an aspirin, and your headache is relieved, that will be reinforcing. Aspirin is not an addictive drug. Pain is the motivating factor. For drugs, I think there's no harm in taking away the dependency state, which is unpleasant, right? If you take that away, you're going to reduce that drive to take the drug. So you'd like to have the
can be dissevered from the pain relief. The sense of well-being or the reward.
Yes.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Could I have a brief comment? While I accept Howard's viewpoint, I think we also have to recognize that chronic pain is also a pathological maladaptive state that reflects abnormal functioning of the nervous system. So it's not just simply a psychological state, a motivational state. That is there. I agree with it, but
don't you think psychological states arise in the brain?
No, of course they do.
Okay.
There are pathological states of the nervous system, abnormal activity in circuits that are not serving any function other than they reflect damage to that or some abnormal function, abnormal synaptic connections, whatever. So I think my view is that certain chronic pains represent a disease state of the nervous system, and we need to identify what those are and then treat those to both prevent and act on them.
Agree?
I wish we could have the three panelists simply go on for, maybe present another 15 minutes each or so. As that's not possible, I do have one question that's a little different. All of you touched on to different degrees drug development issues. There are a couple of important things in clinically considering drugs that aren't often considered early phase, and I'd like your opinion on when they should be. One is that we seldom give therapies as single therapies. We use these drugs in combination with others. We seldom model that in our laboratories when we're developing these treatments. And the other thing we don't do is we don't often study the drugs in the context of common comorbidities, and that is becoming very important, especially psychiatric comorbidities, but other physiological ones as well. So I wonder if perhaps you could comment on when and where are there important opportunities or obligations there that we haven't previously addressed in our drug development efforts.
Dr. Clark, thank you. I think that's a very insightful couple of questions. I'll address the first one, which is when do we want to look at interactions among different drugs to see whether they are going to be compatible with each other or whether they're going to be, in fact, potentially more dangerous. We do studies in pharmaceutical development earlier on now than we used to, in particular looking at drug metabolism pathways and whether there are certain pathways that might be either inhibited or activated by a new compound that could influence the activity of existing drugs. I have pushed companies to do this in the preclinical range before we ever get near human clinical trials. And when we can show that we don't have significant, as we call them, drug-drug interactions in a preclinical model, that gives us more confidence that we may be able to find compatibility among drugs when we take them into clinical testing. Even then, when we go into clinical testing, we have specific types of tests that we do to look for drug-drug interactions. The FDA has a guideline for how to do that. In terms of my own clinical research, I made a change several years ago to not wash patients out of existing drugs when we do the initial clinical trials, but rather to allow them to stay on stable doses of their initial drugs and add on the experimental therapy to see whether it is more effective or less effective. And there are ways that we can then divide the patient populations into groups and look at those who are taking only one drug at a time or taking combinations of drugs at a time to see whether they are more effective or whether they potentially induce more adverse effects. So in terms of the way that I address that, it's a critical question that I address both preclinically and in early clinical development.
I think the real challenge is the regulatory one. Combination therapy development is extremely difficult from the FDA perspective in terms of showing safety and efficacy of multiple components. And until we solve that problem, it's going to be very... the concept that there may be multiple mechanisms operating in a patient and you need to target them together and you'll get additive or synergistic effect is very attractive, and one can study that. But until we have a regulatory pathway where it is not so difficult and so expensive, it's going to be almost impossible. And therefore, we continue with a single drug acting on single target, which may not be the way these drugs will be used in the clinic.
Yeah, just as a neurologist, there's some nice examples of monotherapy that can be quite effective. Triptans for migraine is a nice example, and Tegretol for trigeminal neuralgia is another. These are compounds that don't work on other types of pains, at least so far. That's been seen. So, and the other thing is just anecdotally, in my practice, the patients always started on one treatment. It was never an opioid. Sometimes it was gabapentin, sometimes it was a tricyclic antidepressant. But then eventually they all wound up on polypharmacy. The principle being they're working by different mechanisms, and maybe there would be an additive or a synergistic effect.
And we have time for a quick question, just one.
Thank you. Dan Ciccarone, Family Medicine, UCSF. For Dr. Fields or anyone on the panelists, buprenorphine is approved for the treatment of opiate addiction. What are the pros and cons of using it for chronic pain?
I can only see pros for using it for chronic pain because it's a partial agonist at the mu receptor. So it doesn't mean that you can't get a certain degree of respiratory depression, but it's more difficult to overdose and get severe respiratory depression with buprenorphine, so that's good. The other thing is that as a kappa antagonist, there's growing evidence that the aversive quality of dependence and withdrawal is partly due to release of dynorphin, which is acting at the kappa receptor, and that there might be some anti-anxiety and antidepressant effects of kappa antagonism. Maybe William would like to comment on that. So I think it's sort of a futuristic drug in a way that ought to be used more often for the treatment of pain.
Well, let me actually, instead of talking about mechanism of action, let me take us from time in the ancient realm, going back to 1979 when buprenorphine was first introduced in the United States and approved for treating acute pain in the hospital as an injectable analgesic. Taking an injectable analgesic into chronic pain is not a good idea. And it took a lot of additional formulation science to put it into a formulation that could be used in an outpatient setting, but initially approved only for treating opioid dependencies. That's where Suboxone and Subutex came from. But just in the last year, a similar oral transmucosal formulation has been approved by the FDA for treating chronic pain. And so that is something that, going forward 40 years, is something that will be an advance that will be therapeutically available in the future.
All right, I would like to thank the speakers. We're going to move to Dr. Richard Bonney, who's going to start the public session. Thank you so much.